So welcome to today's panel, 2SLGBTQ plus Newcomers, Overcoming Social Isolation. My name is Corrie Melanson, and I'm a board member and a co-founder of Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia. And we're a nonprofit based here in Jabuktuk in Halifax. We've been around for about 10 years and sponsor and privately sponsor LGBTQ newcomers. Really excited to be talking to the panelists today. So I'm going to introduce the panelists one at a time, and we'll start with the first question and then move on to a few more questions from there. So Joseph and Ntambi, pronouns they, them. Joseph is originally from Uganda, and they lived in Kenya for close to 5 years before moving to Canada in October 2020 through a resettlement program. They currently work as lead generation representative with SimplyCast and will be commencing their undergraduate studies at St. Mary's University this fall. Meeting new people, discovering and learning new things are some of their hobbies. So Joseph, I just wanted to give you the chance to add anything to your introduction, and then just situate yourself connected or related to this topic of overcoming social isolation.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I wouldn't add anything to that. You've pretty much said it all. My pronouns are they, them. And I've been in Canada for about 9 months. And the topic of self-isolation is one I relate with, because when I arrived, I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any family. So straight from quarantine, I went to my apartment. And I was locked in my apartment for quite some time, I'd say about a month. And, well, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go out. I had no friends. But I decided to join a Facebook group of queer folks in Halifax. And my post was, I'm just looking for friends to talk to. And fortunately, 2 of them reached out to me. And so that's how my social life started.
Yeah, and given that you arrived last fall and COVID and all of the restrictions that were happening, I'm assuming that probably played a role as well in some of your experiences of not being able to connect.
Yeah, it did actually, because I believe there were restrictions when I arrived. And so I couldn't really interact with other people. And so most of my interactions were through social media.
Right.
But that helped.
Yeah.
You know, instead of being stuck in my apartment and just looking at the walls and doing nothing,
yeah,
it helped to interact with people on social media.
And how did you even find that first Facebook group that you connected with?
It sort of popped up. I didn't look for it. I was just looking for groups of queer folks in Halifax. And I can't remember the exact name of this group, but I just clicked the join button and posted something.
Yeah. Great.
And one of these people, one of the 2 people who reached out, one of them ended up becoming my partner.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's quite a story. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and look forward to hearing more as we continue the questions. Ahrthyh Arumugam, please tell me if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Pronouns she, her, and they, them. And they work as the newcomer 2SLGBTQIA+ youth coordinator at YMCA of Greater Halifax, Dartmouth Center for Immigrant Programs. That's quite the mouthful, hey?
It's quite the mouthful.
And they encourage re-envisioning the relationships between international students, newcomers, and immigrant communities with Indigenous peoples, African Nova Scotians, and racialized communities in Jabuktuk, Halifax, especially through grassroots movements. And Ahrthyh is dedicated to nurturing respectful communities with an emphasis on reciprocity and sustainable future. So same thing, first I would invite you to add anything that you would want to about your introduction, and then situate yourself connected to this topic of social isolation.
Thank you, Corrie. I really appreciate it. As you correctly pronounced, my name is Ahrthyh Arumugam. In Tamil, we say vanakkam, which is hello, and kwe, of course, in Mi'kmaq. I also want to say that I am the descendants of indentured laborers from Tamil Nadu, India, who came to Malaysia to work as rubber tapers back in the days. And I am the third generation who were born and raised on the lands of the Temuan people in Malaysia. And I first came to Canada, Turtle Island, in 2010 to the lands of the Musqueam people to study my bachelor's degree in Women and Gender Studies program. And I left, went back home, came back to Kujipuktuk in 2018. I've been here for 3 years now to continue my master's in Women and Gender Studies at St. Mary's University. So we are going to be college mates soon. So I started at the YMCA's about 6 months ago in the Gender Violence Prevention Project as their facilitator, and just about 2 weeks ago started as the newcomer 2SLGBTQIA youth coordinator, and hence my emphasis on making sure that young people are able to build safe and connected relationships, not just within the community, but with different communities across Kujipuktuk. That's me.
Okay. And would you, in terms of the theme of today's panel, I guess you could reflect on, of course, your own experience, but also in working with the Y as well. What are some of the challenges that you've faced or others that you know in terms of social isolation, being a newcomer?
With regards to social isolation, I have to speak from my own personal experience. So especially when I was back in the lands of the Musqueam people, I was a baby queer. I was barely 19 and did not know who to reach out to. And in fact, my very first harassment experience was actually within a pride setting, unfortunately. And I was at a party and this big, tall, large white woman just came and like was completely inappropriate with me, and I was just like freaked out. I was like, I didn't know who to go to. Nobody intervened, and I thought I was in a safe space.
Right.
And that was my first learning experience that not all queer spaces are safe. And I realized that this is something that I want to work on, focus on, making sure that young people who are walking into spaces feel that they're not by themselves. I know, like, I have friends who would like come up with codes like when they're not feeling safe in spaces, but that's often like in a very heterosexual space. So my work with the Y currently is really focused on youth who are aged 13 to 21. And I really am like hoping, this is my dream, my vision, that we would be able to help them to build their own safe code words, like how they can navigate home spaces where they're not necessarily comfortable sharing yet, because you can have a family here and yet still feel isolated. Add to that COVID-19, when you can't reach out and like see friends that you're comfortable with, for example, just creates a whole different level of like safety issues. So that's like what like I really think about when it comes to social isolation. Not to mention, not everyone is kind to you when you reach out to them in like apps. You can be dating someone, but not safe for you.
Right. Yeah, even in reflecting back kind of what you're talking about and Joseph's story, I'm happy to hear that those two people that responded are people that were hopefully safe people for you. And as you say, there are queer spaces that are not safe. I imagine too, you might experience youth spaces that maybe they're mainstream youth spaces that aren't very safe for queer youth, for example. So One of the things I know we've experienced with RANs, with Rainbow Refugee, is folks feel othered in queer spaces, othered in, like, just, again, not safe in kind of many spaces that we may think might be safe for someone.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up that, just that sense of what makes a space kind of safe for someone may not make it safe for someone else. Yeah, thank you, and I look forward to hearing more about your experience. So next on the panel, we have Oriol Salvador, pronouns he, him. And Oriol is a journalist who has lived in Halifax since 2019, originally from Barcelona, Spain. He has also lived on the west coast of Canada, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. He got involved in the 2019 Halifax Pride Festival as a volunteer and joined several committees for 2020. Oriol was elected member of the board of directors at Halifax Pride in October 2020 and founded the Immigrant Committee, co-led with 2 other board members. And that committee organizes the monthly event All Tongues, a closed space for 2SLGBTQ+ immigrants to connect before and beyond the Halifax Pride Festival. Great to have you here, Oriol. Again, I would invite you to add anything to your intro and kind of connect on any reflections connected to the theme of this panel.
Yeah, no, so thanks for the introduction. And yeah, we started this committee, and earlier on we identified this need for a group, and like people needed some connection. So that's when we started those events. And it's interesting because to me, in my idea that I initially thought about was this about a group that would put immigrants and immigrants' needs first, but I was not necessarily thinking of it as a closed group, as a safe space and a closed group for immigrants. I accepted because I saw that was a need that was identified before, and living it, going through these events, I can see why it is. Like, there's a lot of the times issues that as a newcomer you face when you arrive to a new country, when you arrive here to Halifax or anywhere else really, you might not feel as comfortable sharing with people who not share your experience. So that was a very enlightening moment for me to realize the importance of making this a closed and a safe space for immigrants. And yeah, I connect with everything else that previous panelists said. Social isolation as a newcomer is definitely challenging. Like, especially, I can imagine from Joseph's experience when you arrive and you don't know anyone, and especially if you arrive plus the circumstances of the pandemic. So it's definitely, as you mentioned, I have lived in other countries. For the past 10 years, I've been a bit of a nomad. So like coming to each new country, and finding that network of support, that connection is always very challenging. And I think it gets more challenging with age as well. Like sometimes, as a student, you immediately make connections, student parties. It's easier to make even, the most vain of connections. As a young adult, it gets harder and harder. So that is definitely a challenge that I experienced since I came here to Halifax in 2019.
Yeah. So I've kind of heard from all 3 of you, there's definitely some overlaps in terms of some of your experiences of certainly COVID-19 and the restrictions that has placed, just the who do you connect with, how do you connect with them, and what is a safe or a safer space, and who are kind of safe people. I guess the second question is, could you share a few things or add to some of the things you've already shared, a few things that have helped you overcome some of those challenges? So maybe I'll start again with you, Joseph, and yeah, anything you want to share in terms of what has helped to get you from, and I know you've been here a really short time, so from 9 months ago not knowing anyone to now, 9 months later, you're on a panel. Like that's a pretty amazing journey. So how did that kind of happen along the way? What were some of those things that helped you to overcome some of the challenges?
Well, initially, before I moved to Canada, I wasn't the kind of person who would reach out to people to make friends. I was terrible at that. But being here and not knowing anybody, I thought to myself, okay, I need to change. I need to connect with different people. And so, like I told you, I joined that Facebook group just looking for friends, and that worked out just fine. And then a few months after that, the settlement agency that received me, ISONS, had this program, a 3-month program, and I signed up because I wanted to meet more people. So every day I'd leave home and go to the ISONS offices because that's where the classes were conducted. And in my class, we were about 10 students. It was a socially distanced class, of course, given the circumstances. And so I connected with these students, and they were from different countries. So that also helped me to overcome social isolation, because I'd be away from home, and that was a good thing. Right now, I can't think of anything else, but I have some advice for newcomers. It's better to reach out, of course, and then, if possible, to look for your community. I'm not saying you should not relate with others. For example, I come from Uganda. So it would have been best if I had looked for the Ugandan community in Halifax. I know that would have helped. That is not something I did. I didn't do that, but it could have helped. But nonetheless, I reached out to other people and they responded. So that helped.
Yeah. I also realized from your bio, you have a job, and what was that experience like in terms of just how did you manage to do that? Not manage to do it, but I know that that's a struggle that a lot of newcomers face.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
You were talking about that, like you enjoy it, and it's a pretty good job. And so, just did that play a role in terms of overcoming a sense of isolation?
Getting a job.
Yeah, just getting a job and working and.
I think so. Because I work remotely, and so we don't really, there is no physical interaction. Most of our interactions are online, and by our, I mean me and my coworkers. We usually interact online. That keeps me busy, of course. So yes, it played a role.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna circle back to what you mentioned. It must have been hard. Yes, I understand it's hard for a newcomer to get a job. But through this ISONS program I talked about, what we basically learned in this program was to be able to write resumes and to be able to thrive in a Canadian work environment. And so that helped me to get a job.
Okay.
And we were also taught some interview skills, what to look for, how to prepare for a job interview. So this definitely helped.
Yeah, that's great.
Because when I interviewed, the CEO immediately told me, "You're hired," 15 minutes into the interview. So
Wow.
that was kind of interesting. And it's helped me. Having a job has helped me because I'm busy
Yeah.
from 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And then I have a partner who keeps me engaged, I'd say. We go hiking sometimes, and
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, I think a lot about folks who have a hard time finding employment, and part of that is about sort of that purpose, right? So kind of being able to have, you're busy, you're keeping busy, you're kind of connected to a purpose related to work. So I'm really thrilled for you that you've found some community and you've found employment. So, yeah. Ahrthyh, I would pose the same question in terms of what are some things that have helped you. You've been in Canada longer, you've been in a few different places, but what are some of those things that have helped you overcome some of the challenges of social isolation?
I actually really relate to what Oriol said around being a slightly older person who moves into a space. I did come here to Kujipuktuk as a student. However, I also came when I was a lot older. And I was not in undergraduate school, I was in graduate school. It was very difficult to be in a university where graduate students are extremely detached from the student bodies. So I was not able to build any sort of connection. And the first time I actually felt like I had some sort of like connection with the queer community here in Kujipuktuk was when I went to Oriol to his book launch. It's called the Disintegrate, Dissociate. And that's where one of the person I reached out to very, very kindly, I'm so grateful to Andy until today, connected me to a few other people and even added me to a group on Facebook just so that I get to know them. And from there on, one person reached out to me and said, I'm also looking for a home. Because at that point of time, I was living in a residence and it was extremely isolating because it was not a very queer-friendly space. And again, like with what's happening with housing in Kujipuktuk right now, that was the cheapest I could afford as a student. So it was not very friendly, it was not the safest. Then this queer person reached out to me and who was also looking for a home. So we ended up looking for a home that's affordable for almost a year and a half. And that's how I was able to then find housing in a cooperative that is specifically for women and trans people. And I felt that was probably the best thing I did for my health. Because having a stable roof where I didn't have to move every 4 months, as someone who's an international student who did not have a permanent home here, didn't come here with a family, I currently do not have to move every 4 months or every 6 months. And I'm surrounded by folks in the housing who are extremely wonderful, shares the same vision with me when it comes to like what it means to have an affordable housing. And on the other end of it, I also work at shelters and supportive housing, and I see on a daily basis how some of the trans folks that I work with are misgendered, and that's just the tip of the problem. Not to mention everything else where sometimes they face violence too. And I really think that one of the ways where we can decrease social isolation is by actually having QT BIPOC housing services. And I think that also reduces violence that we experience for people of color, Black people, and for Indigenous people. And the other thing that I did was around like for job, for example. While before COVID-19, I did not have an issue to like find part-time positions. But during COVID-19, everything came to a halt. And I was having a really hard time, not to mention not to have an income, but also being stuck at home. And I'm someone who I need to have a routine because of some of my other abilities. And when I eventually had a research assistant position with the Restoring Climate Just Futures project, it was the one thing that I would look forward to every week. We would have a weekly meeting and just seeing those people. One was in BC, the other two are in Antigonish, and one is in Halifax. And I would just look forward to it because we were all exhausted from COVID-19, but we brought so much into our meetings, like each of us, and it was just amazing to have a space that was able to like remind me that I am still something in this space. And that's what a job did to me, in addition to like having an income. And then when I started working at Y, the idea of being able to go on a transit without potentially contracting something, just being out there and about and like see more than just one person every day, it did a lot for my brain health, but also my emotional health. So yeah, that's what the additional layers of COVID-19, it definitely took a toll on me at least.
Yeah. And I hear too from both of your stories, there was Joseph, when you talked about, you know, I need to be different or do something different in order to kind of reach out. And then Ahrthyh, where you talked about like going to an event that connected with, you know, who you are or your interests. So just that idea of, it really sounds like it does take that, you needing to kind of take a first step in terms of making some initial connections. And then from there, you were able to kind of widen those connections. But that's kind of a thread that I see between your narratives.
Yes.
Yeah.
True.
Thank you.
I think that is also, and both aspects of, you know, fighting against social isolation and also finding a job, something that I can take from my experience and as maybe as a learning thing is just, you just need to keep trying. Like both with maybe new social circles you will meet and with jobs that you will apply to. Like maybe it's not that one, but you just keep trying and keep looking for, if this social circle has not resulted the safe space you were looking for, keep looking for other groups and keep meeting other people. And with the jobs, the same thing. If this job that really looked for you, it has not been for you, just keep trying and applying for the jobs. And from my experience, eventually, just by maybe a chance of probability, you end up finding what you were looking for.
Right.
So that's definitely something that I have experienced myself as well.
Yeah.
Or you create one, as you did.
And what has been your experience with the committee that you've been working with? Like, how long has that been going for?
So the committee, we started first meetings probably in November. 3 of the new members of the board of directors co-founded it. And yeah, I think so it's probably in November, December we had the first meetings. And it was very interesting because also from my experience as a newcomer here in Halifax, I thought of an immigrant group having completely different needs than what we identified they had.
Right.
So, for instance, in my story, throughout COVID-19, I struggled with my work permit. I was here with an open work permit. That open work permit expired. I had struggled to like find a way to extend it, and eventually I became a permanent resident quite recently. But what I missed when all of this happened was this network of support that could guide me of like, this is what a work permit looks like, you know, these are all your options. And I remember in early meetings of the committee, we made a survey that we started circulating among the community. And that was one of the aspects that was not as much as a need that people identified. There was more the need for connection, the need for a group, like we eventually created the All Tongues event. Then also the need for resources and information, not just about Pride Festival, but about other resources for 2SLGBTQ plus people in other languages. And it was interesting for me because like those were not necessarily needs that I thought would be as prominent as those surveys and that initial feedback showed us. And yeah, then the online meetings that we were able to have online because we were still going through restrictions with the pandemic were also very positive. As I said, I learned the importance of having a closed space and how that made people that I met, some of them I met before, and I knew they were very reserved on talking about specific things on those meetings because they were sharing the experience with people with a very similar experience. They were much more open about sharing them. So that was, and you know, that was very comforting that I was that we were creating this space at Halifax Pride for these people to be open and find that support and that connection. And yeah, now we happily starting to make more in-person events, and I continue seeing that it's a really positive thing that I think the community, the 2SLGBTQ plus immigrants community here in Halifax appreciates, to have that chance to meet people with a shared experience.
And what's your vision for like this group of people, or this all tongues kind of?
Yeah, well,
event?
so I hope it continues, and what I want the immigrant committee and events like All Tongues is to continue growing. And so the feedback that I received from other immigrants, for instance, in 2020, where they were like, oh, I'm not sure the Halifax Pride Festival is for me. Like, I'm just new to here. I don't know anyone. I don't feel safe going.
Right.
So I hope that as the All Tongues and the immigrant committee group grows, that happens less and less. That newcomers to Halifax feel this as a safe space and as a space that they can come to.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really, I think, obviously you've hit on a need for, as you say, a closed space, a safer space for newcomers and immigrants and migrants to share their stories and meet one another and connect with one another. So yeah, that's really great. So I just want to ask kind of all of you to kind of look forward, and if you had 3 wishes kind of to change the experience of other newcomers in Jabuktuk, in Halifax, in terms of social isolation, what would be some of the things that you would have wished for, that you would wish for others? And I say 3, but you don't have to stick to 3. Maybe you have 1 wish, maybe you have 5, but just, you know, what's something that you would wish for others?
I could go first.
Yeah, sure.
As I already mentioned earlier, I definitely think that a supportive housing or like a shelter system for specifically queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color exist, because I think the settings are just very different. It really kind of like similar to like the space that you have created with the community, except this means that they're also in an environment, like home environment, where like they have specific needs met. It really facilitates conversations that you can't necessarily have in other spaces, and like really be able to like practice home settings, for example, around like faith, religion, without having to answer someone else around like how you practice it. Because you can be, I mean, with like youth, sometimes you can't do that in the way that you want to at home, the way that you want to. And the other things that come to my mind is I really wish there's a lot more space to support young people, especially when it comes to like newcomers and like refugees. I work with so many of them, and a lot of services are geared towards adults. So in my current position at the YMCA as the 2SLGBTQIA newcomer youth coordinator, my goal is to support those who are from, say, 13 years old to like 21. So like for folks who are in like mid school to like high school, and also for those who are like just entering university, to kind of help them to build those networks as they learn to navigate different parts of their identities. Because first of all, biologically, it's a very challenging experience. And imagine if you're thinking about transitioning. And imagine on top of that, you're also trying to build a community, but it's so, like when someone asks you a question and you are not able to necessarily share with their identity, or like you say one thing in the beginning and eventually you realize that's not really who I am. And then you change and people are like, that's not what you told me before, you know? And like a very common thing is like, say for example, when we share as someone is a bisexual person, they might not feel comfortable saying that because there could be biphobia in the group that they currently have access to. So being able to like create spaces where young people able to navigate these conversations that are not just complex for them, but for different communities in general is very important. And stemming from that idea, I think, again, it's one of my vision is to have peer-to-peer support groups. Where, again, as I said, comes from my experience, baby queer, like a decade ago. I think it's so important to nourish young people to know that you have space to talk about this. And generations now are like a lot more aware of like how to get support for themselves. Because I'm with Joseph, like I'm not someone who usually go out there and like try to get support. I'm not that kind of person, but I have had to recently or like in the past for survival purposes. And I think current generation could actually use that too. That's really some of like the things that I envision for future.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, the basic needs, right? So housing is, as we know, kind of a crisis here for everyone, but in particular, if you're more vulnerable as a newcomer without a lot of connections, because really that's how typically people will find kind of housing, and then to have a housing situation that is safer is just critical for folks. Yeah.
Maybe just to add to what she said.
Yeah.
I know services exist that help newcomers, but I think they're not accessible. Most of the newcomers don't know about these services. So maybe they should be advertised more so that the newcomers have access to them. Their services through iSons, language lessons, lots of services. For example, internationally educated immigrants. There are services through iSons that can connect them to employers or, you know, to get certification they need to work in Canada. And maybe YMCA does that as well, I'm not sure.
Yes.
But I think these services should be made more accessible because actually most of the newcomers are not aware of them.
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think, because we're talking about housing, something that also needs to be improved, the access is mental, and especially related to social isolation, is mental health services. I think especially as we went through the harder times of the COVID-19 pandemic, access to healthcare, mental health, and healthcare in general, actually, also as well, services. And as Joseph was saying, maybe better information for newcomers on how to access those services is also a need.
Yeah, and I wonder, something we talk about a lot at RANDS is just even calling something a mental health service, and how that alone
Stigma.
may turn, that's the stigma kind of connected or attached to that. So, you know, we've tried to incorporate things like pottery, and you chat while you're doing something with your hands, or so just that idea that what we have, what exists in terms of services here, may be quite different than some, you know, culturally based services that someone may be used to, or even that idea of going to see a mental health practitioner. So any reflections on what you think, you know, might work or would be an alternative to that?
And something that I also thought about when you were saying about, you know, presenting mental health services in a more culturally appropriate way, one thing that we also detected that because it's maybe not part of my experience, I didn't think as much on, but we identified through the work in the committee, is there are newcomers that come, 2SLGBTQ plus newcomers that come here with families who might not be accepting of their identity. So how to reach out to them, how to offer them support while they can keep, you know, the safety within their families. It is also a very challenging aspect that I don't have the answers. I don't know how it could be tackled, but it's definitely something that in terms of social isolation for newcomers, for 2SLGBTQ plus newcomers is also something that maybe not, as a more direct, because, if you present like a 2SLGBTQ plus workshop to a family of newcomers where some of them might be homophobic or transphobic, they will not accept it. But if you can present that through a more, culturally appropriate way for those groups, that could start changing the minds. Maybe that's a way. But I think that in terms of fighting social isolation, that is also an aspect that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, and it also makes me reflect, Ahrthyh, on your suggestion or your wish around peer-to-peer programs and peer-to-peer support, and should that be something that's more prevalent? I know, Joseph, you talked about not necessarily connecting with other Ugandans, but if there was a program set up for you to, here's a few people that you may be able to connect with who have also experienced being a recent newcomer, for example. I think, is that a more culturally responsive way to then connect folks to one another and maybe kind of bridge that divide of, a mental health service?
Yeah, definitely. I think it definitely helps finding someone with your shared experience and your shared culture. Because often, and they're great, but a lot of the time services for immigrants, they're run by people who are not immigrants themselves. And, the services are gladly appreciated and really help. But having someone not been, taking you through them that has gone through that experience, you find it much more relatable.
Yeah.
Sure.
So that's the peer-to-peer is definitely a great idea.
Representation matters.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Would you want to add anything more about kind of your experience with peer-to-peer, or?
Actually, yes.
Yeah.
I would argue that Joseph's experience with reaching out to someone who's on Facebook was actually a peer-to-peer experience.
Yeah.
And yes, representation does matter, because I know someone who told me yesterday, I was out hanging out at an urban farm with a bunch of youth yesterday. One of them came to me and said, would you be at the next one? Because I finally see someone who looks like me and I can speak our language. And I was just, when something is true, but then you find something that backs it up. And recently, Transpulse Canada shared that 1 in 5 newcomers, and we are not even talking about immigrants who've been here for more than 5 years. We are talking about brand newcomers. They hesitate from seeking support because, first of all, they carry trauma from where they're from. So back in where they're from, support systems are not to be trusted. Your children can be taken away. Your children can be harmed. You can be harmed. And therefore, when they come here, they do not necessarily have trust. It's a process that needs to be built. And not to mention around different understanding around mental health support. A lot of it sometimes is attached to a religion or to a faith. And that's why I think that the peer-to-peer support is extremely important, because, for example, Francesca Ekwayasi, a Nigerian writer, and also Carmel Farabaksh, who is currently the executive director of Youth Project, they both produced a video on what it means to be a queer person who also practices their own faiths. And if when you really think about it, to be able to have these spaces to talk about it with someone who's already gone through the difficult times and kind of bounce your ideas, it's a very supportive space where you're not going to be judged because they have gone through it themselves. So that's why I think that it's extremely important to have spaces like All Tongues, because then you are in a space where you can talk about it and yes, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and it reflects. So I think it's very, very important. And as an international student, it's very hard to connect with someone who don't necessarily understand what you've gone through, even though you're around the same age. And not just based on research, but also with some of folks that I have interviewed in the past, they tend to be with a housemate who's an international student themselves, or be in relationships who's an international student because they understand what's the gap when it comes to like not having all access to something that's being offered to them. So this is where like status comes in conversations, like what you were talking about on work permit. We don't even really talk about it here around like non-status refugees and immigrants, except for Halifax. No one is illegal, and some migrant networks. But other than that, there's so little space to understand what it means, or even try to get support when you don't necessarily have a recognition by the Canadian state. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think your reflections on representation, in a way too, they go back to, Oriol, what you were talking about, where even though you're a newcomer, an immigrant here, and you created this space, you had assumptions about what other people might need. And then you did an assessment and you asked people what they need. And just also the importance of that. So even if there are peer-to-peer, like, yes, absolutely. And then even other services, always asking like what it is that folks need, as opposed to making assumptions. I know, again, at RANS, as we try to become more newcomer-centered, as opposed to, thinking that we kind of know what folks need exactly, the need to have more representation at every level of our organization, for example. And, I know Halifax Pride has worked a lot on that as well. But that, that representation, not just kind of token representation, but so that voices are present and voices are in more, decision-making positions as well. Yeah. I think, and maybe this feels like a repetition, but I would really love to hear what, if you could give advice, so a little bit different than a wish, but more if you could give advice to another newcomer about how to kind of more easily create those social connections, what would that be? And maybe I'll start over with you, Oriol, this time.
I would say, besides making the new social connections in your new place, don't lose your past connections. Because that continue being rooted on those, I think it is important to have that support. And that support can be your family, can be your chosen family, because, having being still in contact with your family, sadly, is a privilege for a lot of 2SLGBTQ plus immigrants.
Yeah.
But yeah, stay connected. Like, I have seen my family and my friends over the past 5 years, probably more on a video call than in person. But it's still, and with my best friend, we might just talk once a month. Like, we don't talk and then, hey, I'm free today, and we have like a 2 hours call. But keeping that connection is important, and it keeps you, like, while making new social connections is challenging, having that support still keeps you moving.
Yeah.
So, and that would be my advice, to not lose those.
And you bring up, I think, a really key point, which is chosen family. Because, again, from my experience with RANS, a lot of the relationships with family of origin were really broken and harmful and violent. And so that idea of chosen family, and so I really appreciate you bringing that up, to know that it is, I think, it's an additional barrier that queer newcomers and refugees may face. And so to, again, not making the assumption that someone would have a connection to their family of origin, for example. But yeah, I think that's so not necessarily, breaking those ties, but how to integrate past connections, past family and other connections with your life now.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Ahrthyh, what would you add in terms of advice?
I got a bit choked up on what you shared, Oriol, because honestly, that's how I have survived phone calls in the past year, and especially when you're so far away from family and you can't travel. My journey, which is again a privilege to be able to travel even, like it takes at least 28 hours to get back home. So phone calls are extremely important. But in terms of an advice, I would definitely kind of highlight a bit of like what Joseph said around getting the support that you need. And unfortunately, as you shared earlier, like bringing together services are like as very important. But as someone who's at the back, who's like with the services, I've come to realize that when you're being supported through like fundings, unfortunately, you're pit against each other. And to really centralize and focus on like the well-being of the people you actually work for, and not for the people who give you the money, means that you might have to be able to be creative around like how you support people. So for example, in my case, I can't share anyone who's not a PR. I can't support anyone who's not a PR. But out of that setting, I can be part of a committee. I can be part of a group. Like for example, I am still a part of like one of the student groups where I still share everything that comes my way. All my resources that I have access to, I share it with them and I tell them, this is where you can apply for jobs. When you have not had a job for 5 months. You know, especially when you're a person of color or a black person of who's queer, being in workplaces is so hard in the sense that in addition to being stigmatized as a black person, they're also being stigmatized as a queer person. So as such, they have had to be very careful around like what type of workplaces that they want to be part of. So yeah, being creative around like supporting other people is very important. And taking care of yourself is, I think, has become such a cliche. However, I've had people I've lost due to mental illness, and those are some of the largest losses that I've had, and which is why I'm so focused on supporting young people, because that's when you build those very important skills on how to support yourself. Yeah, if you don't have an answer, ask someone.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify for folks who may not know the acronym PR. Can you explain?
Permanent resident.
Yeah.
Again.
So, yeah. So through your work, you support folks who are permanent residents. Is that? Yeah. Yeah. And you brought that up earlier too, when you have a different status, whatever, or you don't have, you're waiting on an application or that sort of thing, then you're even in a more precarious situation. And there are very few supports available to you.
Especially in those gray areas.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I know you shared some advice before. Would you have anything to add, Joseph, in terms of?
Well, to add to what I said, I definitely advise any newcomer to look for a support network and to get out of their comfort zone and reach out to people, because it helps. That's all I can say.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So that's really the end of our questions, but is there anything else that you would like to add that I haven't asked about this theme? Social isolation, and anything else kind of from your experience that you think is important to share? I'll just kind of throw that out there generally.
I think, I'm trying to think, but I think we covered a lot of different aspects. So yeah, definitely getting out of the comfort zone, still reaching out to your network, even if it's a past network, you know, back home.
Yeah.
Just keep trying, because yeah, you sometimes, you know, you don't get the job or friendships break, but like just keep trying, because eventually you find that network that you need. And if you don't, just reach out, like look for resources, as Ahrthyh was saying. Yeah, it's very important to just seek out help if you need it.
Yeah.
I think that that's key.
I also kind of learned from your experience, Oriol, is if you don't see it, create it, right? So the need that we are a pretty small city, There's not a lot of like services, in particular those that are more kind of culturally responsive, and so the need sometimes to kind of create what you need. So to create kind of your own version of what it is that you need. So kudos to you and others for creating that
so
committee.
just shared effort, but yeah, we're really happy with it.
Yeah.
And maybe I just want to say this. Newcomers should look for services geared towards them.
Right.
Yes, because through these services, you can easily find a job, make new connections, and you never know what stems from that.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder too about, so through COVID, we've lost a few queer spaces here in Halifax, and we've never had, a queer kind of community center like other cities do. So, like your experience was of, finding folks through more social media and an online space, and you're creating online and in-person services, and I'm assuming, again, the Y was doing a mix of kind of online and in-person, but that importance too of space and spaces that are welcoming, that are safer spaces, and really I want to say maybe the lack of some of those spaces that we do have, and the need to kind of really, and you brought this up, Ahrthyh, the need to really think creatively about how do we meet some of those needs with kind of a lack of a broader kind of community center.
Yeah, it was brought up about like resources that maybe need to be advertised better. I think it would be very useful for the city, both for the immigrant community and for the non-immigrant community, to have, as you were saying, a center. Like I come from a bigger city. Barcelona launched its LGBT center maybe about 3 years ago, and it's sort of an umbrella space where like everyone can, like their LGBT families have an association there, trans people who need resources have a space there. So like in the space that could gather all those services, so people have a clear place that they can reach out to. And also it would be very nice if more of a social aspect to it as well. That would be a really good addition for the city, for sure.
A newcomer to us LGBTQIA space, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences, your wisdom, and your advice with me and with us today, and really look forward to hearing more about All Tongues and what the Y is up to, and also just also journeys of individuals as well. So
And RRANS too. You're doing some pretty amazing work.
Yeah, we're trying. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.